Hello there, this is Richard Arlen Blake coming back to you with the 14th episode of my podcast Béaloideas, Folklore Now. So the last few episodes I have been going over the folklore of specific states to sort of give you a regional variation, a regional insight into folklore and how each region has a lot of its own unique aspects, as well as a lot of things that it shares with other areas. You will find that there are a lot of stories and a lot of kinds of music or traditions that are similar, but they are definitely distinct to that particular region. With the advent of more traveling and people moving from place to place, of course, a lot of things do cross boundaries. That is one of the things that we discussed when we were talking about folk music way back when I was discussing several projects that I was doing as it related to folk music. So, having already done Rhode Island and Delaware, the two smallest states in the country, I now want to go to the state of Maryland. So, the state of Maryland I chose because it has several things in it, several aspects to it that are not only unique but have personal references to me as well recently, because I have actually recently been to the state of Maryland, to Baltimore, and have actually gone and interacted with a lot of people there and seen a lot of things that are of historical and cultural significance. With these particular things here in Maryland, you'll find that there are a lot of diverse changes that happen when you just get from one area of Maryland to another, which was similar to how it was, of course, decades ago before there was huge migration and traveling between the states. And my main visit in Maryland was in the city of Baltimore, and that was because the American Folklore Society was having its annual meeting there, and it just so happened that there are also two lighthouses right there in Baltimore, and so my lighthouse project, I was able to go and get 2 stamps for my lighthouse passport book. The funny thing about that is one of the places you go to get the stamp is a ship called the Constellation, the USS Constellation. When I told a lot of people that, I was going and I was seeing the USS Constellation that was in Baltimore Harbor, a lot of people of my connections online actually kept asking me, don't you mean the USS Constitution? And then, of course, you say, well, no, the USS Constitution is actually in Boston Harbor. It is not in Baltimore. It is the Constellation that is in Baltimore, and that boat itself has a lot of history that can date back to the time of the Civil War as well. Having gone through many events in history, that ship actually does have a really interesting past to it, including a few things concerning ghosts. I will get back to that at another time, because here at this point what I want to do is I have already, the last couple states I've been talking about what the state emblems are, like the state birds and the flowers and so forth. Since I had done that for both Rhode Island and for Delaware, I felt that it was imperative on me to do the same thing with Maryland. Now, in Maryland's case, the state bird is the Baltimore Oriole, which I think you might all consider certainly appropriate considering the baseball team by that name, the Baltimore Orioles. And the state tree is the white oak. The flower is the black-eyed Susan. I have not yet found out who Susan is and why she has her name on the state flower, but that's kind of one of those things that you can look up for yourself, because like I said, this isn't quite folkloric enough for me to go too much into there, but I do think that understanding the fact that every state has these sort of things that they choose is a cultural thing that is sort of government regulated, but that people embrace when it comes along. And of course, the state animal is the blue crab. Interestingly enough, I have talked about the blue crab before as it relates to Delaware and about how people go and they fish for blue crab around that area. And since Delaware and Maryland are like right next to each other, it makes perfect sense that that particular animal would happen to be found in both places. It's just that in this case, it is the state animal. Then, of course, there is one of my favorite things that it so happens is the state song or the state anthem. Maryland's state anthem is called Maryland, My Maryland. It is actually a song that it was written back in 1861 by James Ryder Randall. What's interesting about this is while the Song of Delaware talked about each of the 3 counties that make up Delaware individually, and then they have a final verse that they sort of tacked on at the end many, many years later to solidify it. In Maryland, this song, Maryland, My Maryland, actually is almost like a telling of history of Maryland and about a lot of things that happened there. The song itself is said to be a call upon the people of the South to rise up against the U.S. forces to drive out those imperialists or, whatever you call the Unionists who are trying to take over and destroy the culture of Maryland. With Maryland, then, some people argue that Baltimore actually is the place where the Civil War began. It wasn't the Battle of Bull Run, but was in fact an offshoot of what happened when the Massachusetts militia was traveling down through the state of Maryland in order to get to Washington, D.C. They needed to bring President Lincoln, the newly elected President Lincoln, to Washington, D.C., and of course Maryland was kind of in the way. A lot of people who were sympathetic to the Confederacy rioted there in Baltimore and attacked the Massachusetts militia. There was fighting that went on across the city. And there in the Camden Street train station, a huge riot and fighting had finally been suppressed by the Massachusetts militia. And this song was pretty much generated there, and it spread out through the Confederacy. And interestingly enough, it became a kind of anthem of its own to support and inspire the Confederate States to rise up and continue fighting. And what's even more interesting is that the state of Maryland itself never seceded from the Union, but actually remained as part of the Union during the Civil War, despite what the sympathies of many of those people in Maryland had. Part of the reason why Maryland didn't secede as well was because the American troops were in there and helped to quell those kinds of things and keep any kind of uprising from happening. And you can understand why they were out eager to quench any sort of potential uprising ideas of the Marylanders, since Washington, D.C. is right there and right next to Virginia, interestingly as well. So here is the song Maryland, My Maryland. After I play that for you, I will talk a little bit more about it, and then we'll...
The despot's heel is on thy shore, Maryland, my Maryland. His torch is at thy temple door, Maryland, my Maryland. Avenge the patriotic gore that flecked the streets of Baltimore, and be the battle queen of yore, Maryland, my Maryland. Hark to an exiled son's appeal, Maryland, my Maryland. My mother, stay to thee I kneel, Maryland, my Maryland. For life and death, for woe and weal, thy peerless chivalry reveal, and gird thy beauteous limbs with steel, Maryland, my Maryland. thou wilt not cower in the dust. Maryland, my Maryland, thy beaming sword shall never rust. Maryland, my Maryland, remember Carroll's sacred trust. Remember Howard's warlike thrust, and all thy slumbers with the just. Maryland, my Maryland, come 'tis the red dawn of the day. Maryland, my Maryland, come with thy panoplied array. Maryland, my Maryland, with Ringgold's spirit for the fray, with Watson's blood at Monterey, with fearless Lowe and dashing May. Maryland, my Maryland, come, for thy shield is bright and strong. Maryland, my Maryland, come, for thy dalliance does thee wrong. Maryland, my Maryland, come to thine own heroic throng that stalks with liberty along, and ring thy dauntless slogan song. Maryland, my Maryland, dear mother, burst the tyrant's chain. Maryland, my Maryland, Virginia should not call in vain. Maryland, my Maryland, she meets her sisters on the plain. Six Emperors, the proud refrain that baffles minions back on Maine. Maryland, my Maryland, I see the blush upon thy cheek. Maryland, my Maryland, for thou wast ever bravely meek. Maryland, my Maryland, but lo, there surges forth a shriek from hill to hill, from creek to creek. Potomac calls to Chesapeake. Maryland, my Maryland, thou wilt not yield the Vandal toll. Maryland, my Maryland, thou wilt not crook to his control. Maryland, my Maryland, better the fire upon thee roll, better the shot, the blade, the bowl, than crucifixion of the soul. Maryland, my Maryland, I hear the distant thunder hum. Maryland, my Maryland, the old line bugle, fife and drum. Maryland, my Maryland, she is not dead, nor deaf, nor dumb. Huzzah, she burns the northern scum. She breathes, she burns, she'll come, she'll come. Maryland, my Maryland.
So I'm not sure how easy it is for all of you to make out all the words of that song. It kind of goes in and out with legibility on what it is that they're singing. But one of the first things you might notice is that it's the same tune as the Christmas song, Christmas Tree, Oh Christmas Tree. Certainly that's probably how that song got that particular tune, but this particular song precedes Christmas Tree, Oh Christmas Tree. So you could say that, there's just a lot of time-honored, really old, traditional sort of folk tunes that get tacked on to many different songs. Like the American National Anthem is actually, the tune to that was actually taken from an old drinking song. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. But anyways, you'll notice at the beginning of the song there, it says, "The despot's heel is on the shore, Maryland, my Maryland. His torches at thy temple door, Maryland, my Maryland. Avenge the patriot's gore that flicked the streets of Baltimore, and he the battle queen of yore, Maryland, my Maryland." So that's talking about the fighting that took place in Baltimore at that depot, and that there were many people who died as a result of the fight there at that particular train station. And of course, I was at that train station myself, and there is a Civil War history museum there at that particular depot. There's no train tracks going by there anymore, of course, but anyways, that museum is really interesting. It's small, but it is still gives out a really good vibe of understanding about what the Civil War was like for them, being in a border state that was a slave state but remained as part of the Union. The person who was there at that museum was a veteran himself, and he had a lot of family history and things that went back to the time of the Civil War. And it's always nice to talk to some of these people to see what they might have to tell you. Anyways, that's the state anthem of Maryland. Now what I'm going to jump back to the things I was saying about lighthouses and the USS Constellation. So as I said, the USS Constellation, it is docked there in Baltimore. Right across from it, of course, is the Chesapeake, which is the light ship that once was sent out into Chesapeake Bay to pretty much light the way through the bay. It has not been in use for that purpose for quite a while, but the Chesapeake anyway is where one goes to get one of those stamps with your passport. It was nice getting that. The second time I had to go to get a stamp for the 7-foot Knoll Lighthouse, I actually had to run through some torrential rain to get to the USS Taney, because apparently the stamp wasn't at the lighthouse itself, it was on board the Taney. And I got drenched as I was running across Baltimore to get to this particular place. Whenever they say it's a 10-minute walk, they mean a much longer walk than that, unless you really know how to move. Anyways, we go to the Constellation. There are several ghosts on this ship that actually, the ship dates back to 1797. And it was built for the purpose of the defense against the marauding freebooters that were pretty much rampant at that time. After the American Revolution, of course, there was a bit of lawlessness that had to be taken care of on the high seas, and this was one of those ships that was sent out to help deal with that. Whenever a ship, of course, is involved with a lot of violent altercations, there's always possibilities of ghosts being a result of things going on there. A lot of times ghosts, they think, are the reaction to horrendous events happening to people as they die, or where something happens that is so important that the ghost feels like it has to stick around for one reason or another in order to either see something through, because they're just compelled to keep coming back with their sense of loss. One of the ghosts, of course, that is haunting the ship is named Neil Harvey. So Neil Harvey was a gunman. Well, he manned one of the guns on the ship. And during a fight back with the first captain of the ship, the first captain of the ship's name was Captain Thomas Truxton. And while that captain was captain, apparently Neil Harvey fell asleep on duty, and the ship actually came and interacted with a French freebooter, and of course there was an altercation and that French ship was captured. Well, Captain Truxton was so angry that this gunman had fallen asleep that of course he took him, tried him, found him guilty, and executed him, because that's the way they did things back then on ships. If you fall asleep on duty, especially during a time of conflict, that's treasonous and that's the end of you. And so Neil Harvey, his ghost remains on that ship. A lot of times people have been said to have seen him and mistaken him as an actual crew member on that ship, if you can believe it. I don't know how he's dressed. Usually when you see a ghost, they're always dressed in the time period in which they lived. And since the Constellation, I guess, has been sort of a museum ship for a long time, maybe they just assume that he's there dressed in that time period's clothing. That's the story of Neil Harvey. Interesting enough, Captain Thomas Truxton, his ghost, is said to haunt that ship as well. And he's supposed to be wandering around that ship. You don't see him as often as you do Harvey, but this captain is there. Apparently, he feels compelled to remain where he is, to be diligently watching his post, kind of like that History of Magic teach on Harry Potter, where apparently he died. He was teaching one day, he ended up dying that night, but then his ghost came out and continued teaching History of Magic. You might get the impression that maybe this is something like that, or his death, coincided with a time period where America was still being plagued by a lot of problems at sea, and so this captain felt compelled to come out and continue being on that ship. Another ghost is a former crewman who was said to have not been able to handle the rigors of the sailor's life, and he ended up hanging himself. And we see that person's ghost wandering around. We have no idea what that particular person's name is. And then we have the example of Carl Hansen. So Carl Hansen was a former crew member of the ship as well. In the mid-20th century, he was a night watchman. And apparently this spirit is a more happy, uplifting type of person. And then he walks the deck in mortality until 1963, and he was retired back in 1963. Then the other ghost that I think is really interesting here is that of it was an 11-year-old boy. He was a surgeon's assistant, and apparently this boy was murdered on board that ship by a bunch of thugs for some reason or another. Either he had caught them in the act of committing some crime and so they felt compelled to stab him, or maybe they were trying to rob him. The story isn't completely clear about that, but the Constellation is full of ghost stories like this. And as I've noted, this is possibly one of the more haunted ships out there in the world that is still afloat, of course. And, unlike the Queen Mary, it's a lot smaller, and it's not used as a hotel like the Queen Mary is either. So, anyways, that's the nature of the ship called the Constellation. The next thing I want to talk about is a situation back in 1814. So during the War of 1812, the city of Baltimore was a major hub for shipping and manufacturing and a lot of other things. And so the British had decided that they would go and they would attack Baltimore. Now, they did this right after they had burned Washington, D.C. to the ground. While one British force was marching up the road to get to Baltimore, another naval contingent was sailing up through Chesapeake Bay, going in towards where Baltimore is. And between them and Baltimore was Fort McHenry. So Fort McHenry, the Battle of Fort McHenry, is what inspired the writing of the Star-Spangled Banner by Francis Scott Key. Apparently, he was so overtaken by what he saw when he was on board that British ship that he wrote it down. He was actually on a British ship overlooking the attack on Fort McHenry. And of course, there was a very large bombardment going on there, and there were several people who died during this battle at Fort McHenry. But as our national anthem indicates, our flag was still there and it remained standing. The British were not able to take Fort McHenry, and they were not able to get through our defenses. But one of the things about Fort McHenry is because of the battles and things that had taken place there, of course, there were a lot of deaths. And one of the people who died in the Battle of Fort McHenry was a man who went by the name William Williams. He was the only black soldier who was standing there in defense at Fort McHenry. He was a runaway slave, and his real name isn't William Williams. That's the name he went by when he was there at the fort. But he stood there and he fought to defend this city against the attacking British, which is really impressive considering the status that he held there. And apparently one of the cannonballs had gotten in and destroyed a certain place, and he happened to be there and he died. And so his ghost remains there at Fort McHenry. And when I visited Fort McHenry, of course, I went around and I saw all these things and I saw these places. They pointed out where different things occurred during the battle. As usual, I was not there at nighttime, and so I wasn't there when the majority of ghost appearances occur. Even though you don't actually see the ghosts there in the daytime, or you don't encounter them it is really a solemn place if you really appreciate what it is that happened there. And William Williams, or Frederick Hall, that was his name before he changed it to William Williams to hide the fact that he was a runaway slave. Those ghosts, some of them, like he, remained there as sentries to watch there over Fort McHenry for if the British should come back and attack once again, as they say. And at that fort, of course, they have a lot of history documentaries about what happened there, which is understandable. It's just amazing when you sit and contemplate the things that happened at these events. Of course, there are several stories about heroism of the people who fought there at Fort McHenry, and anyone who ever goes to Baltimore, that is a must that you have to go see.